The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Immigration Law 101, What Every American Should Know, with Mara Kimmel. From green cards to citizenship, asylum to enforcement, U.S. immigration law touches families, workplaces, and communities across the country. Immigration Law 101 will demystify the system's basic structure and explain why an informed public matters more than ever. Mara Kimmel has a long career in Alaskan public policy focused on rights and justice in northern communities. She is the executive director of the ACLU of Alaska.
Good evening, everyone. It is such an honor to be with you all, and I'm really, really grateful to the Juneau World Affairs Council and to KTOO and to all of you for coming out tonight. My colleague Luann Hawkes-Lopez and I have been enjoying your snowy weather here in Juneau. Next time we're coming in the summer. But we are thrilled to be able to provide information to the different communities, different organizations in your city about immigration and how to be prepared for these times. And tonight's conversation is, we're taking a deeper dive into the history of immigration in the United States. And I hope actually that instead of leaving with answers, you'll leave with a lot of questions, because this is one of the most confusing areas of law that I've seen as an attorney. And I think most attorneys would agree it's a really, really difficult thing to navigate. And I'll get into that a little bit. But I wanted to first start out with the basic premise that the right to relocate is a fundamental human right that has been identified throughout history, but most recently as a result of the 1945 UN Convention, and specifically the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And Article 14 of that UN Declaration on Human Rights very specifically says that by virtue of the fact that we are human, we have a right to migrate. And thinking about when in time this convention was created, it was 1945. It was right after World War II concluded. And obviously we learned some lessons back then where we thought maybe maybe we cannot rely on governments to protect their own citizens and their own residents. And so we need some external controls that are globally recognized by all of the nation states in the global community that will allow for people, when they are being persecuted or harmed, either by their government or an entity that the government cannot and will not control, they have a right to relocate. So in addition to having the right to relocate, countries have a responsibility to accept people and to then determine whether they want to bring people in as either asylees or refugees. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more. I'm going to dive into what the difference in those terms is in this conversation. But we hear a lot in the news, and I'm going to be also talking about all of the myths and misinformation that underlies our current immigration system. And one of those pieces of misinformation is that there are people who are illegal. If you stop to think about that, how can that possibly be a reality? You might not have authorization to be where you're living, but by virtue of the fact that we exist, we are not illegal. And by virtue of the fact that we exist, we have fundamental human rights that have been recognized, again, codified in international law since 1945. The issue of immigration has always been newsworthy, but particularly in this last year, it has become, I think, one of the guiding discussion points that we've had as communities. And I will just share that it has been incredible to travel around the state and to meet with hundreds and thousands of Alaskans who are seriously concerned about what immigration law is and what enforcement of those laws is doing to our communities. But immigration has again recently really resurfaced as one of the most pivotal issues of our time. At the end of 2024, there were 123 million people who were forcibly displaced. 123 million people. That's 1 out of every 67 humans on the planet. That's a lot of people, and this is a record high number. You may recognize some of the nationalities that are part of that forcible displacement. We've got Afghans, we've got Ukrainians, we've got Venezuelans, Haitians. These communities are very familiar, I know, to folks in Juneau, because you have welcomed in people from those communities. Those are some of the highest, most represented people in this 123 million. The UN High Commission for Refugees reported that on March 5th, more than 330,000 people have been forcibly displaced within the Middle East. Most of those people have not yet crossed a border, but all of the international organizations that deal with human migration are readying themselves for those cross-border episodes and for people to start to move. So the Iran conflict that we're seeing right now is really fueling a new refugee crisis, the likes of which we have yet to experience, but we know that we will. And it's in the face of that reality that people who are forcibly relocated are experiencing this force, again, at record high numbers. So in 1951, again, 6 years after the end of World War II, the international community came together and created the UN Convention on Refugees. And in 1980, so almost 30 years to the year after the UN Convention was formed, the United States adopted provisions in the Immigration and Nationality Act that provided for asylum to be a civil right in our country as well. So people who come to our country have a right to apply for political asylum. What that means, we hear a lot in the news about we heard a lot about the surge of immigrants on our southern border, and that people were crossing illegally, and that, again, people are illegally in the United States. But by virtue of the fact that the UN adopted an asylum structure in its immigration code means that all of the people who showed up on the southern border actually had a right under US law to apply for asylum. So again, the myth about illegal and illegality is not founded in law or in human reality. So I want to step back for a minute and do a little bit of political science 101. In this nation, we have three distinct branches of government. We have a legislative branch who makes the laws. I'm hoping you all know this. We have an executive branch who enforces the laws, and we have a judicial branch who interprets the laws. Those three branches each have a unique role to play in immigration law in terms of creation, but also in terms of enforcement, which I'll get into in a minute. There's also another critical component of the immigration legal framework in our country, which is that we divide power across layers of government. So we have the federal system of government, and the federal government has specific jurisdiction over very specific elements of our lives. And then we have state governments who have complementary, generally, jurisdiction over different parts of our lives. And then we have local governments, and we have tribal governments. And each government occupies a distinct lane in the rules and regulations that they can create that define our patterns of lawful behavior. For purposes of this discussion, the responsibility of who controls our borders largely falls to Congress. So Congress gets to basically define US immigration law. When you come into the US, how do you go, what process do you go through, what process is available, what kinds of options are available to you? And then it's up to the executive branch to enforce that. And we're seeing a president now who rode into power promising to really enforce federal immigration laws. The judicial branch in an immigration context only gets involved in very narrow circumstances. So when you hear the terms immigration judge or immigration court, it's really important to understand that those are administrative courts. Those are not courts like we think about when we think about the courthouse down the street here in Juneau. That's a court that is created under the judicial branch of government. Immigration courts and immigration judges are basically run through the executive branch, which means that the president has ultimate control and ultimate authority to define their roles and their responsibilities. And we have seen, again, a president who has been asserting his authority, terminating, firing a whole bunch of immigration judges, creating backlogs, really pressuring immigration courts to make certain types of decisions. In terms of the distinction between the federal level and the state levels of government, that also becomes incredibly important in the immigration context. So immigration is the pretty much exclusive purview of the federal government, meaning that states cannot define who can come into the United States, even who can come into their own state. So even if somebody promises, hey, I want to come to live in Alaska from Bermuda, I promise I will only stay in Alaska, Alaska has no authority to allow that person entrance. Those decisions are completely defined by our federal system. That's really, really important, again, because that means that state and local governments do not have the authority to enforce immigration law, unless there's a specific agreement that allows them to do so. So if, for example, Juneau Police Department or the Alaska State Troopers decides that it wants to help ICE with enforcement, it's unconstitutional for that to happen. That's really, really important as well, because as we're watching what's happening around the country, there are states that have agreed to cooperate with the federal government. There are local governments around the country that have agreed. But in Alaska, there's only 2 agreements, and those are both through Department of Corrections. So in our state, we cannot and should not be seeing state or local law enforcement participating in these activities. So there have been, this slide is really only a smattering of some of the statutes that Congress has enacted that regulate immigration law. And then I highlighted the 3 key ones that I wanted to talk about. But really, this started when the United States formed as a country. One of the very first things that the first Congress did is say who is a US citizen and who isn't. And at that point, it was white property-owning men. It took a whole series of events to lead us to the middle of the 19th century, when the 14th Amendment really cracked open this idea of citizenship in this nation, where the first provision of the 14th Amendment recognizes that people who are born in the United States are, by virtue of that birth, US citizens. And that was done as part of the Reconstruction Amendments to make sure that slaves and former slaves who were born in the US had citizenship. So citizenship can be granted in one of 2 ways. It can either be done on an individual basis, or it can be done en masse, as was done in 1868 with the 14th Amendment, which declared all people born here are US citizens. On April 1st, that provision of our Constitution will be argued in front of the US Supreme Court. And this administration, this executive administration, has decided, its first day in office, issued an executive order unfurling birthright citizenship, saying that that's not actually what the Constitution meant. And so our organization, the ACLU, and a whole bunch of other organizations have come together, and that case will be argued on April 1st. So I commend you all to watch and listen. It is one of the most important cases, I think, of our times. The other thing I want to point out here, which is not highlighted, but in 1924, Congress also declared that all Native people, all Indians born in the United States, are also citizens. That was another example of a massive grant of citizenship. 1924. That's relatively recent, just 102 years ago. But that's the kind of power that Congress has, to just wave a wand and say, this is the way it's going to be. Hopefully, the Supreme Court on April 1st will see that wisdom. We really didn't get a holistic, comprehensive framework for regulating immigration into the United States until 1965, when the second Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. And that was a real effort to just kind of bring together all of these different pieces into one legislative framework. And it was the groundwork upon which we have been building since 1965 through the INA. So that was pretty pivotal. It was really the first time. I mention that because one of the other myths and misinformations about immigration is, well, why can't they come the way that my family came? My family came lawfully. My family came in 1900, and they emigrated completely lawfully. Well, if you look on this list, you'll quickly realize that in 1900, we did not have the comprehensive immigration framework that we have now. There were no lines to get into in 1900 when my family emigrated, for example. That system didn't take hold in our country until 1965. So again, people who are saying, my ancestors did it right, why can't you? It's an erroneous presumption and assumption. I mentioned already the Refugee Act of 1980. There was another piece of pivotal legislation, the Violence Against Women Act, that is really important, I think, for a lot of Alaskans in particular, because what this allowed people to do is if you were the victim of domestic violence and your spouse, your US citizen spouse was your abuser, you no longer needed to rely on that person in order to process your own paperwork. So that was also pretty pivotal. But 1996 was one of the worst years for immigrant rights that we have ever seen. And this was a law that was signed by a Democratic president, Bill Clinton. Another myth about immigration is that this is a partisan issue. Immigration is not a partisan issue. In 1980, Ronald Reagan declared amnesty for millions of people who had been in the United States. All of a sudden, overnight, people went from being here without documents or without secure status to a path to citizenship. 1996, though, in this law, really wreaked havoc on people's abilities to stay here. And one example that I share is when you came to the United States, when you come to the United States, there are a lot of people who are here, quote, undocumented. And that means a couple of different things. It either means that you crossed the border without permission, or it means that you're here and your visa's expired. It used to be before 1996 that if you happened to be in that situation and you met the love of your life and you got married, you could do what's called adjust your status. You could apply for your green card because then you had an opportunity to legalize and to get everything in order. 1996 seriously changed that and said you cannot do that if you entered the United States without permission. And moreover, if you want to apply and regularize your status, you have to leave the United States and face a 10-year bar on returning. It created a whole class of people who were stuck here. And it made it really, really difficult. I cannot tell you how many Alaska families have been impacted by this particular small change in law. The other thing that the 1996 Act did is it made a whole host of activities now deportable. So voting, even accidentally, and I'll talk about that in a second if you want, but registering to vote potentially became a deportable offense. It expanded the list of crimes of moral turpitude, which rendered you ineligible to even apply for a green card. It made some really, really draconian changes and completely changed the face of immigration law in our country. And this is what we get as a result. If you were to look at the immigration code in federal law, it's about this thick, a couple inches. It's more complicated than our tax code. And so it's really, really important that when people are facing immigration issues, they be able to access an attorney to help them navigate through this, much less an interpreter. So people who are here from another country where English is not the primary language have to navigate both language barriers but also legal barriers, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But this is what the system looks like for people who are in the United States, no matter what their status, who want to regularize in the US. There are, in addition to that, there are so many other barriers that people face when they're seeking to come into the US, not the least of which is trauma. So a lot of the work that I did as an immigration attorney was mostly working with people who were fleeing political persecution or people who were fleeing domestic violence. I worked a lot with human trafficking victims, people who had experienced horrors, the likes of which I had never heard of. And it was the most fulfilling job for me in so many ways, but mostly because I got to witness firsthand and be parts of a person's life who experienced things that are indescribable. And to this day, I walk around the streets of my hometown in Anchorage, and I run into my clients, and I know what they've experienced. And these people are just part of our community, contributing members of our community. And having gone through what they had gone through, I don't know how I could have woken up the next morning. But they wake up the next morning, and they show up, and they're here, and they're really, really wonderful neighbors to have. Trauma is a huge issue that folks face. Language barriers, I mentioned that. And then finally, legal status. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of each of these. So I mentioned the Refugee Convention. And I used the terms refugee and asylee almost interchangeably. And I want to explain what the difference is, because it's really, really important. So again, after the close of World War II, the end of World War II, the global community came together and said, never again. We are not going to allow that kind of horror and trauma and persecution to be visited on people in their own countries by their own government. And so we're going to create a whole United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. We're going to create different conventions like the Refugee Convention, the Convention Against Torture, all of those. But within the Refugee Convention itself, it very narrowly defined what a refugee is and how you could seek to get that status. And so the definition of a refugee has three major components. The first is that you have a well-founded fear. That means that you've experienced something that if you were forced to go home, there's a true, identifiable, objective fear that you possess that you will be harmed if you are forced to return home. The second is that fear is of persecution. And persecution is extraordinarily narrowly defined in a series of case law. Many, many court decisions have really defined it. It's not just that you were prosecuted or that you're running away from the law or that you were a victim of harassment. There's particular legal standards that are really onerous that you have to meet. This is not a status that is given out lightly. And then finally, you were persecuted and you have a fear of return because you are a class member in one of 5 different categories: your race, your religion, your nationality, your membership in a particular social group, or your political opinion. What's missing? I heard that. Gender. Yeah. Looking at these categories, you really see the history of the Holocaust. That's who were victims of the Holocaust. It wasn't women who were hauled into concentration camps only because they were women. It was all of these other categories. And oftentimes we create laws and legal frameworks that reflect what we have just gone through instead of having foresight. And instead of really understanding, if we did that then, what are we capable of next? And so our refugee framework, our asylum framework really reflects that. Refugees themselves are people who find their way to a refugee camp, often are forced to stay in that refugee camp for decades. We're talking 10 and 20 years. And while they're there, they get to plead their case to a refugee officer. There's a whole infrastructure run by, again, the United Nations through the International Office of Migration that regulates, immigration flow. Uh-oh, I think I pushed the wrong button. So I'll try to guess. So it regulates immigration flow. Anyway, there are no refugee camps. There's no refugee resettlement function anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. How many Venezuelans have recently been displaced? 7 to 9 million people from Venezuela who have had to flee Venezuela and have not had the, I'm going to put opportunity in quotes, have not had the opportunity to get themselves to a refugee camp like people who were fleeing, for example, the Syrian crisis, which was similar in number to the amount of people that were forced to flee their country. I'm 15% there. So that's what a refugee does. They are, their whole case is adjudicated abroad, and then they are sent to the United States, or to anywhere. Actually, they can. There's refugees all over the world. The U.S. has actually taken very few refugees. At our height, our annual number of refugees that we admitted was about 160,000. Do you remember how many people I said? How many millions of people were on the globe who are forcibly displaced? Over 100 million, yeah. So of that, we took about 160,000 at our peak. I think we're down to about 8,000 now. And from one place, South Africa. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about refugees in Juneau or in Alaska, those are folks who processed somewhere else and have come here and have entered the US with authorization and with a teeny little bit of financial assistance as well. Not enough to pay the plane ticket fare that they have to pay for to come here, but a little bit. And they're eligible for a little bit of financial assistance for the first 3 to 5 years that they're here in the United States. An asylee, on the other hand, is somebody who has to also meet those criteria, those 3 big criteria. You have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of those grounds. But the problem with this is that you are not able to get yourself to a refugee camp, so you have to get yourself into the US. You have to have your case adjudicated while you are in the US. That's, again, what I referenced earlier about the many people showing up on our southern border, coming across a border and immediately presenting themselves for arrest by ICE and claiming asylum. That is not an illegal process. That is everybody's right to do. And then, unfortunately, what happens with most asylees is they get put into detention facilities during the pendency of their case, which is why I put this under trauma as an obstacle, because we are absolutely re-traumatizing people when we put them into detention facilities after having fled what they fled, and even just forcing them to go through that Byzantine process on the previous slide. Okay, language barriers. Language barriers are another big obstacle to integrating into a new home. In 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act, and one of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of national origin, and courts have historically held that the failure to provide language access for limited English proficient Americans is a violation of national origin discrimination. So people have a civil right to language access, and if your organization is either a federal agency or you get any federal funds, you have to provide that access. This is, so nobody conforms to this. Nobody complies with this. And it's been a frustration in our state in particular. We finally, in the late 90s, got the court system to provide interpreters, and that was a huge coup. And that was, again, the late 90s that happened. And so the education that needs to occur about the right to language access has been a long-standing struggle in our state. And I live in Anchorage, where we have over 100 different languages spoken in our schools. It's a real problem and a real issue. And then finally, the last barrier I want to talk about is legal status. So I mentioned earlier that there are, we now, since 1965, we have this overarching framework of how people can seek to emigrate to the United States. There are real serious limitations on your ability to seek entry. There are only 4 ways, and I think actually one of them is no longer available. First, I want to point out, that there's different statuses that you can possess when you come into the United States. You can come in with a non-immigrant visa, which is like you land here and you want to come in, you want to do some tourism. We get a lot of foreign visitors in our state. That's a non-immigrant visa. There are immigrant visas, which are if you're married to a U.S. citizen or you have a U.S. citizen relative, you can seek to get that, which means you have the intent to remain indefinitely. And if you're successful at getting that, you can live and work in the US indefinitely. Lawful permanent residence is also known as a green card. It's a status that is the last step on your way to citizenship, and then finally citizenship, which you can get citizenship in a number of different ways. You can get it through, even if you were born abroad, you can get it through a US citizen parent. You can get it through the naturalization process. You can get it by virtue of the fact that you were born in the US, and hopefully that'll stay after April 1st. Okay, there are really, really limited opportunities for people to seek any of those immigration visas. So you either have to have a job that qualifies you for a visa, and those are very, very narrow job classifications that are available to you. So generally, they're super highly skilled folks that are able to seek an employment-based visa. In our fisheries in Alaska, people can come here and get H-2B visas, they're called, which are the same visas that agricultural workers in California or in the Central Valley have. So we do have those opportunities to support our fishing industry, although those have been really greatly curtailed. But generally, you have to be highly qualified and highly skilled. We see this all throughout Alaska, though. We've got teachers who are here on different kinds of J visas and H visas. We've got doctors and healthcare workers who are here on similar visa types. So we have a range of employment opportunities for people. Family-based visas. So if you have a qualifying relative, and again, that's a very narrow definition. If you're married to a US citizen, if you have a US citizen parent, then you can apply for your green card. If you happen to have a child, that doesn't give you a child in the US, that doesn't give you any grounds until that child turns 21 to apply for citizenship or a green card. So we've all heard the term anchor baby, which is a horrific term, but that's also just a falsehood. You can't come here and have a baby and then you yourself be able to stay in the US. So you can get deported, and your kid can stay here, or your kid can go with you. And then finally, then you have asylum and refugee status, which I mentioned earlier. And then we had, I think this has been eliminated under this administration, a diversity visa lottery, which is exactly what it sounds like. We wanted to make sure in our benevolent immigration policies, we decided that we wanted to be a melting pot. We wanted to have people from all over the world be able to come and live in the United States and live the American dream. And so for countries that are, quote, undersubscribed, where there's not a lot of balance in population numbers, we provided this diversity visa opportunity. And there are many Alaskans who've benefited from this. There's a whole lot of terminology associated with immigration law, which I'm not going to get into, but I just threw up a couple of different words that you might or might not have come across if you're working with these communities. One of the big ones that we're seeing right now is deportation. We see mass deportation on signs all over the place. We see it in the news every single day. We also hear about people who are in the United States without documents. And again, that happens in one of two ways. Either people come across the border without authorization, or they're here and their visas have expired. So I want to talk a little bit more, though, about immigration in Alaska. So in our state, there are 55,000 of us who are foreign-born. It's about 8% of our state's overall population. And that number has continued to rise. I have Anchorage up here just as sort of there's very little data that's publicly available. And in Anchorage, we've done some deep dives into the data. So we've produced information like this. But you can see the rise in foreign-born Alaskans over the years. you can also see the diversity of folks. Again, in Anchorage, there are over 100 different languages spoken. In Juneau, you've experienced a boom of people resettling from Ukraine, from Haiti, from different parts of the world, probably than you've seen in years past. Alaska has been a very welcoming place for people. There are tremendous benefits when we do immigrant and refugee integration right. There have been a lot of efforts around the state to make sure that we're opening our doors and we're welcoming people in, and we're thinking about different ways of making sure that people can find employment in ways that maximize their own abilities and also then maximize their community's economic wealth and well-being in ways that would otherwise be impossible. So you can see here that throughout Alaska, the total taxes paid by foreign-born Alaskans is about $500 million. That immigrant spending power is almost $2 billion in our state. That's not chump change, especially for a state that has been struggling mightily recently with a budget. Looking at the amount of money that is paid into Social Security by people who, in all likelihood, will never get it back, that's crazy. And Medicare, too. This goes for all immigrants, including people who are here without documents in our state. These numbers are for our state. So a little less than 10,000 undocumented folks, which is almost 20% of all Alaska immigrants. The benefits to immigrant integration are profound and really, really important. If you think about this just economically, you take all that money from people who are forced into occupations that don't reflect their skill set. I'm sure that each of you has a story of getting into a taxi cab driven by a doctor or a lawyer. And you think about the loss of earning power that's not only affecting the families, their families, but affecting our communities, because that means that people aren't buying houses. That means that they're not paying property taxes. That means that they're not entering a consumer economy to the extent that other people who can make higher wages can. So there's a real effort underway to make sure, around the country, to make sure that people's skills and expertise that they bring into the United States and to different states can be matched with economic opportunities. And in Alaska, we're hoping to join the ranks of those states that have the foresight to understand what the economic impacts of immigration can be. And there's a bill in the state legislature right now that would create essentially an Office of New Americans that would design structures that would help newcomer families in our state to make sure that they can get the job skills training, the credentialing, the evaluation of foreign credentials necessary in order to fully participate in our economy. And we're doing that at the same time. That bill is going through our state legislature at the same time that refugee resettlement frameworks in our state are fundamentally changing. In the late 1990s, under Governor Knowles, the governor decided that he wanted to be one of few states, I think there's about 11, who did not participate in refugee resettlement. So instead what happened is Catholic Social Services, which is an organization based in Anchorage, took on the responsibility for refugee resettlement and has been doing a phenomenal job up until this year, when the federal government has said, no more. There were 11 states that did this without it going through state government. We're canceling that. So state of Alaska, you've got to take this responsibility on. So we're in the middle right now of a big transition, and it'll be really interesting to see how it all pans out, but watch for more to come on that. Because again, it's really, really important that for people who have experienced trauma, for people who have experienced language barriers, for people who have experienced issues with securing legal status, that those folks can have an easy path into our community. And I know what's in the hearts of most Alaskans. And what's in the hearts of most Alaskans is to be a welcoming community. I was welcomed here over 4 decades ago. And it is something that I take so seriously. And I feel like it's my obligation to pass that on, to welcome more people into my state, which is so sparsely populated and losing people every single day, and who is suffering from these incredible economic challenges that are frankly largely of our own making. And we have ways out of it if we just made sure that every Alaskan was seen and belonged in our community. And our governor recognized this recently when he asked the federal government to make sure that we are able to keep Ukrainian refugees, at least, safe, and not forcing them, in violation of international law, to return to Ukraine, where they will undoubtedly face continued violence, political violence, and potentially persecution. So in addition to those kinds of efforts around the country for states to develop much better economic opportunities for people, because again, that's really all they can do since they can't regulate international law and they can't regulate immigration law. What we're also calling for is fundamental immigration reform at a federal level. Because the last thing I want to say to all of you is that the traumas and the cruelty that we are witnessing on our streets, and that we have been witnessing this last year with increasing frequency, didn't come because this administration created new laws. It came because our current legal system allowed for and facilitated those cruelties. The president didn't have to change much of anything in order to adopt the policies and practices under his mass deportation agenda. What that says to me is that there is something fundamentally wrong with our federal immigration system. And so as we're talking to Alaskans all over the state, we're also asking that once, if you care about your neighbors and friends, which I know we all do, that once this urgent crisis passes, and that once we're able to get through witnessing cruelty after cruelty on a daily basis, that you stand with us afterward and make sure that our federal system is overhauled and that we have created policies and practices that reflect our humanity, not our cruelty. Because that's ultimately, we cannot lose sight of the long game here, even though we are all incredibly distracted by some of the short-term and very urgent needs of our people. So the last thing I'll say is that for immigrants and refugees in Alaska, there are just an incredibly limited amount of services for folks. And these are the organizations that are available to help people. I said that there are 55,000 foreign-born Alaskans. There's about 6 to 10 immigration attorneys in our state. There's just this mawing chasm between the need and the ability to serve that need. And so what we've been doing at the ACLU is really trying to help fill that need through making sure that Alaskans are educated about their rights, are educated about what to do if you happen to witness an arrest and an enforcement action, and that you're able to help your neighbors and your families to make sure that you're safe. Also, too, in order to best protect people, it's really important that we be informed about what you're seeing in your community. So we also have a mechanism on our website where if you're witnessing things, you can report them to us so that we can then share information. One example of how quickly the on-the-ground situation is changing is a couple of weeks ago, there was a family that was picked up in Soldotna. And within, I think, 36 hours of being picked up, the mom and her 2 youngest kids were back in Mexico. We have never seen anything that fast. And it's really important that the practitioners and the advocates and the allies understand what's happening on the ground so that, again, we can educate people as to how best to protect themselves. So we're doing all of that, and we really need your help doing all of that. Thank you. And we have time for questions.
If you have questions, please make use of the mic. Just go ahead and queue up.
Good. We're all done here.
Could you comment on the apparently rapidly expanding visa bond program and what the scope of visas that are impacted by that?
The visa bond program?
Where a visa applicant is required to post a bond on the interview for their visa at a consulate or whatever, and the bond has to be paid before their application will even be processed. There were new countries added to this list just today, apparently.
That I'm not as familiar with as I should be, so I don't want to comment too in depth, but what you made me think of was just the increase in visa rates that have skyrocketed. But this, I think you're talking about the people on the list of like 50 or 70 countries. Yeah.
It's about 70 now.
Exactly. So in the first Trump administration, there was the list of countries that were banned from coming, and I think this is the way around that, is to just essentially price people out of the market. So if that's what you're referring to, that's my take on it, is that.
So are these primarily business visas, or?
They could be any kind of visa.
Any type of
visa.
visa.
Yeah, they could be refugee visas or business visas, yeah.
Okay.
But we're not issuing refugee visas right now.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. You stumped me.
As an ally or a citizen, if I were to employ an undocumented immigrant or house them, what kind of risk are the citizens running when we assist in a variety of ways?
That's a great question. So it is unlawful for employers to employ people who don't have work authorization. I think that you're subject to civil penalties for that. And your employees would be subject to being removed from the United States if they were caught. And one of the ways that we've been seeing immigration enforcement transpire in our state is through audits of small businesses. So you know how you have to complete an I-9 form for folks that makes sure that you are doing your due diligence as an employer. So you run the risk of violating civil laws, you run the risk of the person being deported. In terms of housing people, it really depends on if you are, there's new enforcement of these notions of aiding and abetting people who are here without authorization. And so we do know your responsibilities presentations for folks where we will educate you about what exactly those terms mean. You've all heard the case of the Wisconsin judge who ushered somebody out the side door and she lost her license and she was criminally prosecuted. So you as a person who is aiding and abetting are subject to criminal penalties for that. And the definition of aiding and abetting is pretty technical. And so these are, again, issues that we cover in our Know Your Responsibilities presentations. And if you have questions, we urge you to contact one of those 6 to 10 immigration lawyers, but also we are training other attorneys throughout the state to help with issues like that. As a side note, I would also just offer this question of sanctuary. During the Central American Wars, churches would house people. And so this notion of being a sanctuary sprung up, and a lot of communities around the country have said, we want to declare that we are a sanctuary city. This is also a term that has no basis in law. There is no such thing in the US Immigration Code, in that 2-inch thick thing, that talks about sanctuary cities. So it's also a myth. And it's a myth that has really backfired on a lot of those communities, because now what has happened is under Trump 1, we saw a lot of cutting off of federal funding to those cities. We see those cities being targeted. They're blue cities typically, but they're targeted for increased enforcement actions. So there's so much caution that needs to happen, while at the same time, we need to figure out ways to be human in working with our neighbors and our families to make sure that they're safe. So if you're thinking about things like this, it is really important to contact an attorney to know exactly what your liability is.
My question was actually about sanctuary cities. You had spoke about the role of the state in immigration law, and I was wondering about the role of a city. You just mentioned sanctuary cities a little bit, but are there other things we can do on the city or the local level legally?
Yeah. Legally, not, again, to grant status or to protect people from deportation, but there is so much that a city and a state can do to create a welcoming community. And there's an organization that I've been a part of for many, many years called Welcoming America, which has created a whole framework for cities and states to encourage public policies that are more welcoming, that will make people feel safe. Again, it won't grant status, because cities and states cannot do that. But it will create economic practices that are more integrative. It will make sure, it will work with cities to adopt language access policies so that when you go down to City Hall and want a business license or a permit, you can have access to an interpreter, or if you go to the hospital, you know that the hospital will provide an interpreter. So there are practices and policies that cities and states can implement to really enforce this idea that we all belong here. And also local law enforcement can be very active in making sure that their communities know that they're not going to be enforcing federal immigration law, that they're enforcing state law and making sure that people are safe and secure. And if you're a crime victim, don't be afraid to call. That's incumbent upon every police force and every mayor, every elected official in our state to make sure to go into communities that are impacted and to make sure that those communities know that their local government at least has their back. Their hands are tied, definitely, because you can't grant status. But as much as you can do up until that point to make sure that there is a sense of belonging and a sense of inclusion, cities have so much potential to do that. And I just recommend that you go look at Welcoming America's website for different ideas that you can advocate for within your own city.
Mary, you talked about how when this is over, we also need to work on fixing immigration law. I was wondering if you could speak on DACA.
Thank you.
And also DACA right now for.
Thank you. So what Andrea was mentioning was the deferred action on childhood arrivals, which was when President Obama was president, he recognized something that, again, advocates have known for a very long time. And it's actually a result of this policy that I mentioned in the context of the 1996 Act when families couldn't regularize their status. There were so many kids who have been taken into the US as babies and then have had no opportunity to apply. Their parents have had no opportunity to apply for legal status, even if they're married to a US citizen or their parent is a US citizen, their step-parent. And so what ended up happening is a whole class of people who have grown up in the United States speaking English, many of whom had no idea they were not born here and didn't know that fact until they said to their parent, I want to go get my driver's license. And the parent had to say, sorry, you don't have a birth certificate, and the state of Alaska won't give you a driver's license unless you're a US citizen or have lawful status. So many kids were finding this out, and so many kids were experiencing this that President Obama created by executive order this deferred action for childhood arrival, which meant it was an executive order, so it didn't have the force of law because he's not Congress. But in the meanwhile, he was giving people the ability to seek to stay here in the hopes that we would get Congress to amend our law. And so that has been on the books, but again, under Trump 1, it was, he canceled it essentially, but people have been given reprieves. And so it's a status that you can no longer apply for, but those people who have it, by the grace of stays and court finaglings, have been able to stay, but it's not a long-term solution. We still desperately need that kind of law. That would be a piece of the federal immigration reform that we desperately need.
Folks, I think we're at time. We could thank our speaker one more time.
That was Mara Kimmel in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with KTOO. It was recorded March 18, 2026 at KTOO in Juneau. JWAC presentations are supported by season sponsors Core Alaska Kensington Mine, Wastman and Associates, Ramada Inn, and Jim Clark.